The courtroom was busy that Tuesday morning. People shuffled in and out, lawyers talked in hushed voices, and the air felt heavy with worry. Among the crowd sat Michael Thomas, a man in his late 30s with dark skin and short, neatly trimmed hair. He wore simple clothes, blue jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a black jacket. Nothing about him stood out. He looked like any other person waiting for their turn before the judge. Michael checked his watch and took a deep breath. For 15 years, he had worked as a police detective. He had solved difficult cases, caught dangerous criminals, and earned the respect of his fellow officers. But today, he wasn't here as Detective Thomas. He was just another person with a traffic ticket. "Next case," called the court clerk in a bored voice. "Michael Thomas, speeding violation." Michael stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom. His steps were confident but not proud. He had nothing to hide and nothing to prove, or so he thought. Judge Helen Roberts looked up from her papers with cold, blue eyes. She was in her 60s with gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her skin. Her black robe hung heavy on her thin shoulders like a dark cloud. She had been a judge for over 20 years and had earned a reputation for being strict and, some whispered, unfair to certain people. "Another speeding case," she said with a sigh. "Let's make this quick." Michael began to explain. "Your Honor, I was driving home from—" "I don't need your life story," Judge Roberts cut him off. Her voice was sharp enough to make the court reporter flinch. "Just tell me why you were going 45 in a 30 zone." "I was returning from a late shift, and the speed limit had recently changed on that road," Michael explained calmly. There was only one new sign, and it was partly hidden by a tree branch. The judge's face changed. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes narrowed. Something about Michael had bothered her. Maybe it was his calm confidence, or maybe it was something else. Something about who he was, not what he had done. "You people always have excuses, don't you?" she said. The courtroom went quiet. Several people looked uncomfortable. The court reporter's fingers stopped typing for a moment. "Excuse me, Your Honor?" Michael asked, his voice still steady. "You heard me," Judge Roberts continued. Her voice grew louder, as if she wanted everyone to hear. "Always thinking the rules don't apply to you. Always looking for special treatment. I see people like you in my courtroom every day, thinking you're above the law." Michael stood perfectly still. His face showed nothing, but inside, his heart beat faster. Not from fear or shame, but from something else. He had heard comments like this before. As a detective, he had learned to stay calm when others lost their temper. He had learned to watch and listen carefully. And right now, he was watching Judge Roberts dig herself into a very deep hole. "I've worked hard all my life playing by the rules," the judge continued, warming to her topic. "Nobody ever gave me special treatment. But you come in here expecting me to just let you off because the sign was hidden. That's not how it works in my courtroom." Around the room, people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young lawyer at the defense table stared at her legal pad, her cheeks burning red. The bailiff looked straight ahead, his face carefully blank. Everyone could feel what was happening, but no one moved to stop it. Little did Judge Roberts know that the man standing before her was not just any driver with a traffic ticket. She had no idea who Michael Thomas really was or why he happened to be in her courtroom today. She couldn't see the small device in his pocket, recording every word. She didn't know about the months of complaints that had led to this moment. And she certainly didn't know that in exactly 7 minutes, everything would change. Judge Roberts wasn't finished. She leaned forward in her high-backed chair, her eyes fixed on Michael like a hawk watching its prey. The wooden gavel next to her hand seemed to be waiting for its moment. "So, Mr. Thomas," she said, drawing out his name with a hint of mockery. "You expect me to believe you, a grown man, couldn't see a speed limit sign? Do you know how many times I've heard that excuse in this courtroom?" Michael kept his voice level. "Your Honor, I understand your concern. I'm simply explaining what happened. The city maintenance records would show that the sign was reported as partially hidden by overgrown branches 3 times in the past month." A few people in the courtroom looked at each other. This man knew what he was talking about. He didn't seem nervous or unsure like most people facing a judge. Judge Roberts' face hardened. "Well, aren't you just full of information?" she said. Her tone had changed from annoyed to something uglier. "Let me guess, you got a friend at city maintenance. Someone who looks like you, willing to change a few records." A small gasp came from somewhere in the back of the courtroom. The court clerk stared down at her papers, pretending not to hear. The young public defender sitting at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Michael's expression didn't change. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, but his eyes, they saw everything. They noticed how the bailiff glanced away in embarrassment. They caught the court reporter's fingers hesitating over her keyboard. They observed the judge's wedding ring twisting nervously on her finger, even as her face showed only contempt. "No, Your Honor," Michael replied calmly. "I don't have any friends in city maintenance. I just did my research before coming to court today." "Research?" Judge Roberts repeated with a short, harsh laugh. "Is that what they're calling it now?" She turned slightly, making sure everyone in the courtroom could hear her next words. "You know, I've noticed something over my 20 years on this bench. Certain types of people always think they can talk their way out of trouble, always have an answer for everything, never want to take responsibility." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, sensing the dangerous path the judge was walking down. "Your Honor," Michael began again, "I'm simply—" "Don't interrupt me," she snapped. Her voice echoed off the high ceiling. "I'm not finished. Maybe where you come from, people don't respect authority. Maybe in your neighborhood, following the rules is optional. But in my courtroom, everyone follows the same rules." Michael took a slow, deep breath. His face remained a mask of professionalism, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but purpose. He had come here expecting something like this, hadn't he? And yet, hearing it in person in a public courtroom was still shocking. Judge Roberts misread his silence as shame or defeat. It only encouraged her to continue. "You people need to understand that actions have consequences," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "The law doesn't care about your excuses or your feelings. So I'm going to make an example today. I'm setting your fine at double the normal amount." Around the courtroom, people shifted in their seats. Some looked down at their hands, embarrassed to be witnessing this. Others stared in disbelief at the judge's open hostility. One elderly woman in the back row shook her head slowly, her lips pressed together in disapproval. Michael remained perfectly still. His years of training had taught him to stay calm in the face of provocation, but there was a limit to what anyone should have to endure, especially in a place meant for justice. And Judge Roberts had just crossed that line. 7 minutes had passed since Michael first stepped up to face Judge Roberts. 7 minutes of insults, assumptions, and clear bias. 7 minutes that would change everything. Michael looked directly at the judge, his calm never wavering. "Your Honor, before you finalize that decision, there's something you should know." "Oh?" Judge Roberts said with a smirk. "And what might that be?" "Another excuse." Michael reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The bailiff tensed up, his hand moving toward his belt. But Michael only pulled out a small leather wallet. When he flipped it open, a gold badge gleamed under the courtroom lights. "My name is Detective Michael Thomas. I work with the County Special Investigations Unit." The smug smile vanished from Judge Roberts' face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The courtroom, already quiet, now felt like a vacuum. A pen dropped somewhere in the back, the sound unexpectedly loud in the silence. "For the past 3 months," Michael continued in the same calm voice, "our unit has been investigating reports of judicial misconduct in this district. Specifically, allegations of racial bias and abuse of power." Judge Roberts' face turned an alarming shade of white. Her hands gripped the edge of her bench so tightly her knuckles showed bone. "What is the meaning of this?" she finally managed to say, her voice no longer commanding but small and thin. "The meaning, Judge Roberts, is that today wasn't about a speeding ticket." Michael tucked his badge away. "Our department has received 17 formal complaints about your courtroom behavior in the past year alone. All from people of color who received unusually harsh sentences or were spoken to in a way that violated their dignity." The door at the back of the courtroom opened. 2 people in plain clothes walked in, a man and a woman, both wearing expressions as serious as funeral directors. Everyone knew without being told that they were also police officers. 3 weeks ago, Michael continued, the district attorney's office authorized an undercover investigation. I volunteered to take the assignment. The traffic ticket was real. I was actually speeding, but my appearance in your courtroom today was planned. The young public defender was now sitting up straight, her eyes wide, legal pad forgotten. The court clerk had stopped pretending to work and was staring openly. Even the bailiff looked stunned. You can't do this, Judge Roberts said, finding her voice again. This is my courtroom. You have no authority to. Actually, we do, Michael said, not unkindly. We have a warrant signed by Judge Wilson of the Superior Court. He nodded to his colleagues who were now walking down the center aisle, and everything that happened in this courtroom in the last 7 minutes has been recorded. Michael tapped his chest, where a small button on his shirt concealed a tiny camera. He also pointed to his watch and the pen in his pocket. 3 separate recording devices, as required by department regulations for undercover operations. All legally authorized. Judge Roberts' face shifted from shock to anger. This is entrapment. You set me up. An older woman in the public seating area couldn't help herself. Nobody made you say those things, Judge, she called out. A court officer moved toward her, but Michael raised his hand slightly and the officer stopped. Nobody set you up, Your Honor, Michael said, his voice still professionally calm. You weren't tricked into saying anything. You chose your words freely. The only difference is that today, those words were preserved exactly as you spoke them. The 2 detectives now stood at the front of the courtroom. One of them, a woman with short brown hair and serious eyes, stepped forward. Helen Roberts, she said formally, I'm Detective Lisa Chen. I'm here to inform you that you're under investigation for multiple violations of judicial conduct, including abuse of power and civil rights violations. You have the right to legal representation during this process. Judge Roberts sat frozen behind her bench. The gavel that had given her so much power lay untouched beside her hand. The room waited for her response, but for perhaps the first time in her long career, Judge Helen Roberts was completely speechless. The courtroom had transformed. What began as a routine traffic hearing was now something historic. People who had been checking their phones or daydreaming sat forward in their seats, not wanting to miss a word. This was the kind of story they would tell for years. Detective Chen placed a thin folder on the table in front of Judge Roberts. This contains just a small portion of the evidence we've gathered, she explained. Her voice was professional but carried easily across the silent room. Judge Roberts stared at the folder as if it might bite her. I want my lawyer, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's your right, Michael said with a nod. And we'll make sure you have proper representation. But I think it's important for everyone here to understand what's happening and why. He turned slightly to address the people watching. Many of them had come for their own cases, never expecting to witness something like this. For the past 6 months, our department has been receiving complaints about this courtroom, Michael explained. People described being treated differently based on the color of their skin. They talked about harsher sentences, higher fines, and disrespectful treatment. Michael gestured to a young man sitting near the back. The man, wearing a delivery company uniform, stood up nervously. Mr. Wilson, they came to us 3 months ago. He recorded audio on his phone during his hearing for a parking ticket. In that recording, Judge Roberts made comments similar to what you all heard today. The young man nodded and sat back down, looking relieved that his part was over. At first, we thought these might be isolated incidents, Michael continued, until we started looking at the data. Detective Chen pulled a chart from her folder and held it up. Even from a distance, people could see the stark differences in the colored bars. This shows sentencing patterns from Judge Roberts' courtroom over the past 2 years, Chen explained. The average fine for white defendants with traffic violations was $120. For defendants of color with the exact same violations, it was $215. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Numbers didn't lie. We also analyzed court transcripts, Michael added. Judge Roberts used words like troublemaker, repeat offender, and lack of respect 3 times more often when addressing people of color. Judge Roberts finally found her voice again. This is ridiculous. You're taking things out of context. I treat everyone the same. Michael didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. Then he held it up. His own voice came from the speaker, explaining about the hidden speed limit sign. Then came Judge Roberts' voice, clear as day. Maybe where you come from, people don't respect authority. Maybe in your neighborhood, following the rules is optional. And then, you people need to understand that actions have consequences. Michael put his phone away. That was 7 minutes ago, Your Honor. Would you like to explain what you meant by you people? Judge Roberts' mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Everyone in the courtroom knew exactly what she had meant. An older gentleman in the back stood up. His hands shook slightly, but his voice was strong. She said the same thing to my grandson last month. Called him you people just like that. Gave him community service for a broken taillight. A woman 2 rows ahead turned around. She did it to me too. Said, people like you always have excuses. More voices joined in, sharing similar stories. It was as if a dam had broken. Years of silent suffering suddenly had an outlet. Michael watched it all with a careful eye. This wasn't just about one judge anymore. It was about trust in the system. About people finally feeling heard. That's enough for now, he said gently after a few minutes. We appreciate everyone sharing their experiences. All of these accounts will be noted in our investigation. He turned back to Judge Roberts, who now sat slumped in her chair. The power she had wielded so carelessly just minutes ago had evaporated like morning dew under a hot sun. The evidence doesn't end with today, Michael said quietly. We have sworn statements from court employees, statistical analyses of your rulings, and recordings from previous hearings. Today was just the final piece we needed. Judge Roberts looked around the courtroom, searching for a friendly face, a supporter, anyone who might speak up for her. But she found only blank stares or openly hostile looks. She had lost the room. And soon she would lose much more. No one in the courtroom would ever forget what happened next. The huge clock on the wall showed it was just past 10:30 in the morning, a normal Tuesday that had suddenly become anything but normal. Detective Chen nodded to Michael, a silent signal passing between them. It was time. Michael stepped forward, his face serious but not angry. There was no pleasure in what he was about to do, just determination to make things right. Helen Roberts, he said, his voice clear and official, as a sworn officer of the law, I am placing you under arrest. The words hung in the air. A few people gasped. One woman in the back actually clapped before catching herself. Judge Roberts' face turned from pale white to angry red. This is outrageous. You can't arrest a sitting judge in her own courtroom. Actually, Your Honor, we can, Detective Chen said calmly. The warrant I mentioned earlier isn't just for an investigation. It's for your arrest on charges of civil rights violations, abuse of power, and official misconduct. The bailiff, a tall man who had worked for Judge Roberts for 7 years, looked torn. His job was to protect the court, but who was he supposed to protect now? After a moment of hesitation, he stepped back, letting the detectives do their job. This is a mistake, Judge Roberts said, but her voice had lost its certainty. I've served on this bench for 20 years. I've given my life to this court. Michael didn't argue. Instead, he walked around to the side of the judge's bench. Please stand up, Ms. Roberts, he said quietly. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. Her hands gripped the edges of her chair like she was on a sinking ship. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. The black robe she wore, the symbol of her power and position, suddenly looked too big for her. Without her authority, she seemed smaller, older, more fragile. But Michael showed no sign of backing down. Turn around, please, he instructed. Is this really necessary? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. I'm afraid it is, Michael replied. There was no cruelty in his voice, just the steady calm of someone doing a difficult job. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. He continued reading her rights as he carefully placed handcuffs on her wrists. The metal clicked softly, the sound echoing in the silent courtroom. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have explained them to you? Judge Roberts nodded stiffly, not trusting her voice to speak. The court clerk, a woman who had worked with Roberts for over a decade, wiped away a tear. not for the judge, but for the moment itself, watching justice finally reach someone who had hidden behind the law while breaking it. Two uniformed officers entered through a side door. They would take Judge Roberts to the processing center while the detectives continued their work here. As Michael handed Roberts over to them, she finally found her voice again. "You'll regret this," she hissed at him. "I have friends in high places." Michael didn't respond to the threat. Instead, he said simply, "So do the people you hurt. They have a friend in me." As the officers led her away, her black robe swishing around her ankles, the courtroom remained silent. The bench where she had sat in judgment of so many now stood empty. Detective Chen picked up the gavel and addressed the room. "Court is adjourned for today. Those of you with scheduled cases will be contacted about rescheduling." People began to move, collecting bags and jackets, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. They lingered, talking in small groups, processing what they had witnessed. A young woman approached Michael as he gathered his notes. "Thank you," she said simply. "My brother came before her last year. He's still serving time for something his white friend got probation for." Michael nodded. "We'll be reviewing all of her cases from the past 5 years. If there were unfair sentences, we'll work to correct them." As word spread through the courthouse, people began to gather in the hallway outside. Phones came out, calls were made, social media lit up with the news. Inside the emptying courtroom, Michael Thomas stood for a moment, looking at the bench. The system wasn't perfect, far from it. But today, at least, it had worked the way it was supposed to. By evening, the story was everywhere. Local news vans parked outside the courthouse. Reporters crowded the steps, hoping to catch anyone who had witnessed what happened. The headline, "Judge Arrested in Her Own Courtroom," flashed across TV screens, news websites, and social media. Michael Thomas sat at his desk, tie loosened, scrolling through the flood of messages on his phone. Colleagues sending congratulations, supervisors requesting meetings, reporters asking for interviews, and most importantly, people sharing their own stories about Judge Roberts. "You wouldn't believe how many calls we've gotten," said Detective Chen, rolling her chair over to his desk. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him. "Over 30 people have come forward since this morning, all with similar stories." Michael nodded, taking a grateful sip of the coffee. "It's always the same pattern, isn't it? One person speaks up, then another, then suddenly it's a flood." "People needed to see that it was safe to talk," Chen replied. "That someone would actually listen." Their boss, Captain Reynolds, walked over. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much over the years. "Just got off the phone with the district attorney," he said. "They're moving fast on this one. Too much public attention to drag their feet." "What about the other judges?" Michael asked. "Roberts can't be the only one." Reynolds sighed. "One battle at a time, Thomas. But yes, there will be a wider review." Across town, in a small apartment, the young delivery driver who had first reported Judge Roberts watched the news coverage with his family. His mother squeezed his shoulder when Michael appeared on screen, talking briefly to reporters. "That's him," the young man told his family. "That's the detective who believed me." His grandmother nodded approvingly. "Takes courage to stand up to power," she said. "Both of you showed it." Meanwhile, in the county jail, Helen Roberts sat alone in a holding cell. Her expensive suit had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit. Her makeup was smudged from wiping tears. Her lawyer, a nervous man who specialized in defending wealthy clients from tax problems, not criminal charges, had just left after delivering bad news. "The evidence is overwhelming," he had told her. "Those recordings, the statistical analysis, the witness statements, it's not looking good, Helen." She had expected him to assure her it would all go away, that her connections would save her, that this was all a mistake. Instead, he had talked about plea deals and damage control. Back at police headquarters, Michael was finishing paperwork when his phone rang. It was his wife. "I saw you on the news," she said. "You didn't tell me you were planning to arrest a judge today." Michael smiled, hearing the pride in her voice. "Wasn't exactly planned that way, but it needed to happen." "The boys are impressed," she said. "Thomas keeps telling his friends his dad arrested a real judge." After hanging up, Michael looked at the framed photo on his desk. His family smiled back at him, his wife and 2 sons. He had become a police officer to make the world safer for them. Days like today reminded him why the job mattered. The next morning, newspapers across the country picked up the story. Opinion pieces debated judicial accountability. Legal experts analyzed the case on talk shows. Social media filled with people sharing their own experiences with biased judges and courts. Judge Roberts' case was becoming more than just one arrest. It was sparking a conversation about justice itself. Outside the courthouse, a small group gathered with handmade signs. "Equal justice for all," read one. "Hold judges accountable," said another. The group was diverse, young and old, all different backgrounds, united by their belief that the system could be better. A reporter approached one elderly man holding a sign. "Why are you here today, sir?" "I'm here because for 40 years, I've watched certain people get treated differently in courtrooms," he replied. "And today, for the first time, I believe something might actually change." Inside the police station, Michael's team was already reviewing Judge Roberts' past cases. They worked methodically, looking for patterns for people who deserved a second chance at justice. "This is going to take months," Detective Chen said, looking at the stacks of files. Michael nodded. "Then we better get started." The work ahead was enormous. But the first, hardest step had already been taken. Someone in power had finally been held accountable. 6 months passed. Leaves changed color, fell, and gave way to snow. Winter thawed into spring. And throughout those changing seasons, the justice system in the county was changing too. Michael Thomas stood at a podium in the main courthouse hall. Behind him hung a new sign, "Judicial Accountability and Oversight Committee." Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone. "6 months ago, I stood in a courtroom not far from here and witnessed justice failing," he began. His voice was steady and clear. "Today, I'm proud to say we're taking real steps to make sure that doesn't happen again." The crowd included reporters, community members, lawyers, and several judges. Some of those judges had initially resisted the changes. Others had embraced them from the start, relieved that problems hidden for years were finally being addressed. "Since Judge Roberts' arrest, we've reviewed over 1,200 cases," Michael continued. "We found clear evidence of bias in 341 of them. That's 341 people who didn't receive fair treatment under the law." He paused, letting that number sink in. Each case represented a real person whose life had been affected. Of those cases, 189 sentences have already been reduced or vacated. Another 152 are still under review. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Michael gestured to a man standing in the front row. "This is David Thompson. Last year, Judge Roberts sentenced him to 6 months in jail for a first-time offense that typically receives probation. Today, Mr. Thompson is not only free, but he's joined our Citizen Advisory Board to help improve our courts." David nodded, standing a little straighter. The crowd applauded. "As for Helen Roberts," Michael continued, "she pled guilty to multiple counts of civil rights violations and abuse of power. She's currently serving a 3-year sentence. More importantly, she's been permanently removed from the bench and disbarred." Someone in the back called out, "Good riddance." A few people chuckled, but Michael raised his hand. "This isn't about punishment," he said firmly. "It's about fixing a broken system. Judge Roberts wasn't the problem. She was a symptom of a larger issue." He pointed to a chart showing statistics from the county's courts. "Before our reforms, people of color received sentences averaging 40% longer than white defendants for identical crimes. Today, that gap has narrowed to less than 5%, and we're working to eliminate it completely." The new chief judge, a woman who had fought for reforms for years, stepped up to the podium. "Every judge in our district now undergoes mandatory bias training," she explained. "And we've implemented a review system where sentencing patterns are regularly analyzed for disparities." She gestured to a new electronic dashboard mounted on the wall. "This tracks outcomes by judge, by offense type, and by defendant demographics. And most importantly, it's public information, available to anyone who wants to see it." The crowd applauded again, louder this time. After the presentation, Michael found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand or share their stories. One older man waited patiently until the others had finished. "Detective Thomas," he said, extending his hand. "I was there that day in the courtroom." Michael nodded, remembering. "You spoke up about your grandson's case." Yes, the man said, smiling. He's here today. He motioned to a young man standing nearby. His case was one of the first ones reviewed. He's home now, back in college. The young man stepped forward. Thank you, he said simply. Not just for me, but for everyone who comes after me. Later that evening, Michael drove home, windows down in the spring air. His phone rang through the car speakers. It was Detective Chen. Just saw the news coverage, she said. Great speech. Michael smiled. Not really my thing, public speaking. Well, you're stuck with it now, Chen laughed. The department's getting calls from other cities. They want to know how we did it. We just did our jobs, Michael said, turning onto his street. No, Chen replied seriously. We did more than that. We proved the system can change when good people stand up. As Michael pulled into his driveway, he saw his family waiting. His older son was bouncing a basketball, his younger son was waving excitedly, and his wife stood smiling on the porch. This was why it all mattered, not just for them, but for every family who deserved to be treated fairly and with respect. One judge's insults had led to a movement for change, and that change was just beginning.